So we're getting some pickup too. I can tell when we go live, so I'm going to stop talking right in about 30 seconds, 3 seconds. There we go. Okay. Yeah. So there we go. And I am going to start the webinar. So those folks are getting some pickup too. I can tell when we go live. So I'm going to stop talking right in about 30 seconds, 3 seconds. There we go. Okay. So I've got to turn off something else before I go live. Just hold on. Sorry about that. Okay. Okay. Okay, I am going to, if any of you want your cameras off as the people come in, you can do that. You don't need to. And I'm just going to start to let people in now, okay? Sorry, there we go. Welcome to those who are joining in. We are just opening up the lines now. We'll just get started in a moment or two. Welcome to everyone who has joined. I'll just give it another moment or two for others to come in. Thank you to everyone for joining on such short notice, and we're really pleased to be able to bring together 5 people to speak about the consideration of the Canada Revenue Agency, which the revocation has been reported of the Jewish National Fund of Canada's charitable status. This has been a long time coming. This move restores trust in the impartiality of the revenue agency to enforce its rules, irrespective of a charity's possible influence. At the same time, we also will want to highlight that the JNF is one of the many Israel-focused charities that have violated Canada Revenue Agency rules. Over the last 18 months or so, detailed complaints have been made and submitted to the CRA, asking to investigate over a dozen other Israel-focused charities. With over 200 charities, Canadian charities, funneling money amounting to over $250 million a year in subsidized donations to projects in Israel, this is Canada's most significant contribution to Palestinian disposition. We will have 5 people speaking to you who bring expertise and knowledge in this regard. And then following that, we will open it up to questions from the media. If you are from the media and would want to ask a question, do contact us in the chat, the hosts and panelists. At the point that we are taking questions, we will open the mic, unmute your mic at that point, and be in touch with you so that you can ask your question as well. We are pleased that our first speaker is Rabbi David Mivasair, who is a member of the Independent Jewish Voices, and also one of the individuals who submitted a complaint, I believe it was in 2017, to the Canada Revenue Agency regarding the Jewish National Fund. David, I turn it over to you.
Hey, thank you so much, Karen, and thank you to everyone for being here today. I want to begin by just introducing myself, actually. So I'm a retired rabbi. When I was a younger person, I decided to live in Israel. I lived there for 4 years. In the early years of my career as a rabbi, as a congregational synagogue rabbi, I used to raise funds for the Jewish National Fund. I encouraged my congregants to donate to it. I was a donor. I supported it financially. I'm saying all this to be very clear with anyone who's paying attention. that it is not anti-Semitic for the Canada Revenue Agency to enforce Canadian law and tax regulations. And it's not anti-Semitic for anyone to oppose tax subsidized donations going to support illegal activity in Israel and in Palestine. So just to say a little bit more about that. It's the job of the Canada Revenue Agency to enforce Canadian law and our Canadian tax regulations. The Jewish National Fund, for more than 50 years, has abused its charitable status. It has directly funded building and development and programs in Israeli military bases. It indirectly turns money over to organizations that directly take land away from Palestinians and give it to violent Jewish settlers. It's ethnic cleansing just directly in Jerusalem and in the West Bank, which is not Israel. The JNF funds this kinds of activity through shell organizations that have different names, but it's still charitable monies from Canada going to that end use. A prime example of this from the past is the development of so-called Canada Park, which was built on top of the ruins of 3 villages that were destroyed by the JNF. A survivor of that, Ismail Zaid, is a retired physician living here in Canada in Halifax. He can talk about his own direct personal experience with his own village, his own home being destroyed by the JNF. And further, the JNF, while it has charitable status here in Canada and in other countries, I wouldn't even consider it a charity. It directly owns tens of billions of dollars worth of property in Israel. It owns it, and it controls directly about 15% of the real estate in Israel, and indirectly, it controls about 95% of all the land in Israel through its seats on the board of the Israel Land Authority. So, although the Jewish National Fund was founded over 100 years ago, it should not continue to be supported by Canadian taxpayers through subsidizing charitable donations to the activities that it's involved with. It's been able to develop considerable political influence by developing relationships with people who control our politics. There's a bird sanctuary named after Stephen Harper. I remember when the Jewish National Fund created a playground and named it after John Baird. And this is how they do things. For anyone who'd like to learn more than we can possibly say here today, I want to encourage you to look at 2 different websites. One is called stopthejnf.org, and another is stopthejnf.ca. And just thank you very much. And I pass the mic to some of the others here who will add more to what I've been able to say today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. And we've got one of the links in, we'll get the other link into the chat in a moment. Any media that have joined, we will turn to questions following the speakers. So do identify yourself and the media outlet you're with if you would like to ask a question. Next, we turn to world famous physician and author Gabor Mate. Gabor has an Order of Canada for his medical work and for his social justice writing. He also signed about a month or so ago a letter to the Canadian government asking for it to take action in this regard, along with a number of other individuals and organizations. We welcome Gabor.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks, David. David used to be my rabbi, actually, at the synagogue that we attended when our children had their bar mitzvah. I'll keep my comments very brief. I visited the occupied territories 3 times, most recently in 2 years ago, when I went to work there with women who had been tortured in Israeli jails and were suffering post-traumatic stress disorder. I led a healing workshop for them. I've seen the occupation firsthand. As to the JNF, I'll make 3 comments about it. It is criminal, it is colonial, and it's racist. And I'm not making moral statements here. I'm speaking in a very objective sense of the meaning of those words. Criminal because it's the recipient of stolen goods. In 1948, the Palestinian population was deliberately expelled and dispossessed, their villages often destroyed, and certainly appropriated, their lands and goods and houses appropriated by the state. And this is in contravention of international law and UN resolutions. Those stolen properties were bought by the JNF for sale to Jewish settlers. This is in Israel. Now, when I worked in the downtown east side as a physician in Vancouver, some of my patients made their money by receiving stolen goods and reselling it. That's what the JNF did. The so-called absentee property, which were the property of the Palestinians who'd been expelled from their lands and houses, was sold by the state of Israel to the JNF for resale. So it's a criminal organization. It received stolen goods. Number 2, it's a racist organization. Would in Canada any institution, organization be allowed to function with tax-deductible donations if it bought and sold land only to a certain ethnic group? What if there was an organization in Canada that only sold land to Christians by its mandate, or only sold land to Jews, or only sold land to Muslims? Would it receive tax-deductible status? So it's a racially exclusive organization by its mandate. And as David has already pointed out, it's a colonial organization because it has taken land. I'm not talking about inside Israel proper now. No, I'm talking about in the West Bank, where it's received land and has used it and has sold it again for Jewish settlement. Now, so it's racist, it's colonialist, and it's criminal. Why should it receive tax-deductible status? As to the occupation itself, I will only tell you that the Canadian media does not report what happens in the occupied territories. I'm not even talking about the horror in Gaza. I'm talking about in the West Bank, where if you read the Israeli press, you'll find that almost every day there are attacks on Palestinians by Jewish settlers supported by the Israeli army. There are what they're called pogroms in the Israeli press. There are burning down and destruction of olive groves, the destruction of homes, the torture of prisoners. This is all documented in the Israeli press, never or hardly ever reported in Canada. And this is that large project of what David accurately called ethnic cleansing that the JNF is involved in. I will stop here. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Gabor. I also will mention that we've heard from Nikki Ashton just now. She is traveling and sends her regards and that she can't join us, but that she is aware of the decision. So we'll hope that maybe there will be statements coming from her office soon as well. Next, we turn to Wesam Ahmad. Wesam is a human rights advocate with the Al-Haq, the Palestinian human rights organization. Wesam will be joining, or is joining us from Ramallah, I guess this evening, Wesam, and we'll be talking in regard to the organizations that are receiving the money that is leading to Palestinian dispossession, war crimes, and potentially genocide from Canadian charities and other charities internationally. Wesam?
Thank you very much, Karen, and thank you to my fellow panelists and everyone for joining. Al-Haq obviously welcomes the news regarding the decision of the CRA to revoke the charitable status of the Jewish National Fund Canada. This is a decisive action and a significant step in addressing the historical and ongoing role that the JNF has played in the colonization of Palestine. For decades, the JNF has been instrumental in the dispossession and displacement of Palestinian communities, using environmental projects as a guise to further these aims. Their activities have included, as has been mentioned, funding infrastructure for Israeli occupation forces and development of settlements on occupied Palestinian land, both of which are contrary to international law and Canadian public policy. And while this decision marks a small step in the broader struggle for Palestinian rights, it is a crucial one. It challenges the impunity that the Zionist joint criminal enterprise has long enjoyed, in which the JNF has played a pivotal role. The revocation of JNF Canada's charitable status is a reminder that colonial practices, which may have been permissible in the past, and Canada is very much part of that past and the settler colonial projects. But this day and age, these practices are condemned under contemporary international law. And I think it's not surprising that JNF Canada would appeal and try to contest being held accountable for actions that they have carried out with impunity for decades. Because their objections fit within this broader narrative of colonialism and its justifications. But as the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion has recently spelled out, that occupation is in and of itself illegal, and these practices of colonialism must be brought to an end. And I think the CRA's decision aligns with these international legal developments, reinforcing the principle that support for military activities and the perpetuation of illegal settlements cannot be masked as charitable work. This revocation is a call to action for Canada and the global community to uphold international law and support the rights of the Palestinian people. And we as Al-Haq remain committed with our partners around the world in advocating for Palestinian rights, and will continue to support measures that hold entities like the JNF accountable for their actions. The struggle for justice and equality for Palestinians is far from over, but this decision represents a significant stride towards ending the historical injustices and bringing those responsible for those injustices to account. Thank you.
Thanks, Wesam. I will just mention, we also do have this streaming to the Just Peace Advocates YouTube live, and recordings will be available and shared following as well. Next, we turn to Shane Martinez, who is a lawyer with the Canadian branch of the International Center for Justice for Palestinians. Shane's work has included filing complaints to the CRA about charitable funds that are being used to support the Israeli military. In fact, the two of those submissions actually predate the 18-month figure that I'd mentioned of a dozen or so other charities that we've also submitted. So Shane has supported those in regard to the Israeli military, and as well has been involved in broader efforts to hold Canadian officials accountable for refusing to halt the flow of these funds. And he will speak about that accountability. And thanks, Shane.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks to Just Peace Advocates and to the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute for including me on such an esteemed panel. I guess I would say that yesterday's announcement by the CRA, as we all know, it comes after years of campaigning by community advocates who stand in solidarity not just with the Palestinian people, but also stand for the rule of law. And CRA policy, it states that Canadian registered charities, when they carry on activities outside of Canada, they can't be used as a conduit to funnel resources to an organization that is not serving a charitable purpose. And the policy of the CRA explicitly states that supporting a foreign army is not a charitable activity. Now, despite this, Canadian charities, they continue to flout CRA policy by funding the university education of Israeli soldiers with donations that are accorded charitable tax-deductible status in Canada. And this occurs even though the Israeli armed forces, they operate on an annual budget that's in excess of 20 billion US dollars. And even though the cost of post-secondary education for individuals transitioning from military service to civilian life is already covered by Israel's Ministry of Defense through its foundation for the unit, through the foundation and unit for discharged soldiers. And Canada's been repeatedly made aware that Canadian organizations which use their charitable status to effectively subsidize Israel's Ministry of Defense by funding these educational programs for Israeli soldiers are operating in this way. And these organizations, apart from some which have been mentioned, include HISEG, the Canadian Zionist Cultural Association as well. And Canada has refused to take any enforcement action under the Income Tax Act or CRA policy, despite the fact that these organizations incentivize enlistment in the Israeli military by rewarding those who participate in its combat operations. One of the recipients of money from the CZCA and HISEG is something known as the Duvdevin Scholarship and Mentorship Program. And for decades, Duvdevin it's a military unit, an undercover military unit in the IDF. It's been the subject of widespread international criticism for an array of human rights violations, including the killing of innocent Palestinian civilians. And in 2019, the Duvdevin Foundation, which is based in Israel, it reported that it had been working in partnership with HISEG and also the CZCA to grant academic scholarships to Duvdevin alumni. And scholarships were based on financial need, but also excellence during Army service. And they also recognized explicitly in their promotional materials that the CZCA could be used for tax benefit purposes. And I guess to conclude, I'll note that last November, the Canadian branch of the International Center of Justice for Palestinians wrote to the CRA notifying them that the Canadian charity to Israeli military pipeline, it was a form of Canadian complicity in Israeli military atrocities, and that we're investigating and will be endeavoring to seek accountability in both domestic and international forums. So we were quite pleased with the ICJ's advisory opinion that was issued on July 19th on the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel and the occupied territories. And the court observed quite specifically that states, including Canada, are under an obligation to not render aid or assistance, including economic aid and assistance, in maintaining the situation created by Israel's illegal presence in the occupied territories. They also went on to state that states must ensure that any impediment resulting from the illegal presence of Israel in the occupied territories is brought to an end. Any impediment to the Palestinian people's ability to exercise their right to self-determination is brought to an end. So I think it goes without saying that subsidizing Israel's illegal military occupation to the tune of millions of dollars a year through violations of Canadian law and policy, that's a clear impediment to the exercise of Palestinian self-determination. And for that reason, we have to continue doing everything that we can to pressure Canada to enforce the law and halt this practice. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shane. And now we will turn to the final panelist for the press conference, Dr. Miles Howe. Dr. Miles Howe is an academic who has published several academic papers regarding Canadian charities and money that has been flowing to Israel, specifically related to the settlements and military and such, and continues to do research in that regard. I turn it over to Miles to speak, but just before I do that, I remind any of the media that may have questions to please contact me through the chat so that we can be ready to unmute you for questions following Miles. So thanks so much, Miles, for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks to the insights from all the other panelists as well. Before I get started, I do want to say that I'm in no way equating the trauma that the JNF of Canada causes within Canada to the horrific erasure and displacement of Indigenous Palestinian people in Palestine. But I will lead with this. From a personal standpoint, I have experienced JNF Canada's processes of indoctrination starting at a very young age. And so what the JNF does is very publicly tells you that there's only one good way to be a Jew. And what it does is it attempts to reroute sacred principles, specifically tzedakah, which is gift giving, helping your fellow human being regardless of religious affiliation. And from a very young age, if you attend Hebrew school, either after school programs or day schools in Canada, you're given a little blue plastic or metal box with which you're expected to fill with change, take home, bring it back to school. And your classroom will have little competitions to see who can raise the most money and who can plant the most trees in Israel. You're not given any more information in that regard but that. And so you begin to very quickly equate being a good Jewish person, being a good Jewish child, with the notion of rerouting your own desires to belong, to do good in this world, to give, etc., to provide to others who may be less fortunate than yourselves. You begin to equate that with giving to Israel, this sort of place in the sky utopia to which you will always have affiliation and belonging should things ever go wrong. And if your parents were subjected to this type of indoctrination as well, as we were talking about the family table last night, it's simply perpetuated. And so that is the JNF Canada. It's and that's what it does in Canada as well. And that's how it raises money and convinces people that to be a Zionist is to be a Jew, and to be at least to even question the notion of the state of Israel is to be somehow anti-Semitic, or to, if you're a Jew, to hate yourself. So you have to firstly get out from under that. That being said, that's not really the point that I wanted to make here today. We're looking at a revocation here, right? And it's a very interesting thing. So what we have to do here is basically put on a bit of an investigation hat, because the CRA is bound by privacy while the JNF Canada is not. So the JNF Canada, in the ensuing time between the federal appeal that it's able to mount here against this revocation, which apparently is happening, is going to start putting out all kinds of, I'm going to call it propaganda. First and foremost, this morning, or perhaps late last night, it raised the specter, of course, of anti-Semitism. And it also said that the reality of why it's going to get revoked is that the CRA has decided that its original charitable purpose of 60 years ago or so, when it was registered as a charity in Canada in 1967, is no longer considered charitable. That purpose, quote, was funds for the employment of indigent laborers on various work projects for which they receive daily stipends. I've been through a number of revocation packages from the CRA, and I'll tell you in no uncertain terms that the CRA has never revoked a charitable status license in Canada over questions of not meeting your self-stated charitable purpose. So I'm going to go ahead and call that one BS. Why then would the JNF of Canada, why now, and why is its charitable status being revoked? Beyond what JNF Canada is going to want you to believe, and beyond what the CRA can't actually tell you for the moment. The panelists here have touched upon most likely the infractions are related to a measure of undirected or control over its Israeli agents in Israel. Specifically, when we look at JNF Canada's overseas activities forms over the last 6 years, you see that its main recipient is an Israeli agent known as Keren Kayemet LeIsrael, which is KKL, let's call it that abbreviation. And KKL JNF is the Israeli entity legally that owns this vast amount of land within Israel. Now, Keren Kayem, or KKL, is very much involved within purchasing land, expropriated under violence and horrific conditions, specifically within the West Bank, which is counter to Canadian public policy. and charities are not to act counter to Canadian public policy, and that's law in this country. In 2018, JNF provided KKL with $6.6 million, 2019, 9.4. There's a steep drop off in 2020. I would say probably related to pressure from campaigns, grassroots campaigns here in Canada, but still 1.2 million flows to KKL, 2021, 1.8, 2022, 3.9, for a grand total over the past 2018 to 2022 of just shy of $23 million going to KKL. Now, the JNF, let's call it through activist pressure, has experienced pushback against its association formally with the KKL. So much so that in March of 2021, the JNF took the step of actually publicly distancing itself from the KKL in a letter to its donors and a letter to its members. It says it removes the KKL logo from its website. It actually removes the KKL acronym from its name, and it signs an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, with the KKL, in which it claims autonomy over its funds, saying that all these funds, this 23, just shy $1 million, is not going towards Palestinian expropriation, but other things. And we're expected here to take their word for it. If I were to put on my Sherlock Holmes hat here, I would say that's probably the issue, given that KKL is repeatedly the JNF of Canada's most prolific recipient of donations. I'd say there's a lack of control, there's a lack of direction here, and obviously the CRA, or I would say most obviously the CRA, which has been very interested in JNF Canada. It has been the subject of numerous audits, again, which as the public we are not privy to, but it has audited the JNF repeatedly. And so if I were, again, to put on my hat and pipe here, I would say that there's something within this relationship specifically that doesn't pass muster. In the past, KKL has gone very far in towards funding projects on land owned by the IDF, on purchasing land expropriated within the West Bank specifically. And so who's to say it does this through its own organization and also through private contractors? Himanuta Limited of the West Bank is a prolific purchaser and expropriator of Palestinian lands. And so my take on this, why here, why now, is that there's something there within that relationship that does not pass the CRA standard. It's a good thing to see this beginning to be enforced finally. As Karen and others have pointed out, there are numerous complaints to the CRA over a variety of charities. The JNF is a key piece of this. It's certainly not the only piece. But as we know also, from those of us who have been involved or who leaf through these types of charitable documents, including, how the CRA proceeds through an audit, it's a long and slow process. And so if I were again to put on my hat, this is related to something that's probably happened at least 2 years ago, because this is what the time sort of takes for an audit to lead to a revocation. And it's been a long time in the works. I would also say do not listen or do not necessarily take at face value what the JNF is saying in terms of why this revocation is now on the table. That is one key takeaway as well. I can virtually guarantee you, after having looked through, I would say, at least a dozen revocation due to failed audit packages, that there is no way possible that the CRA is going to revoke the JNF Canada, an organization with significant political clout within the Canadian sphere, over some kind of misunderstanding over a self-stated charitable purpose. There's way more going on here than we know. And unfortunately, we're going to have to wait for that federal appeal to come out to get access to some of those documents. So at best, what we can do here is keep the pressure on, put on our very, put some cynical lenses on our glasses when we read press releases from the JNF, because it will be a one-sided experience for those of us involved in this. Mainstream media in Canada does a fairly abhorrent job of covering this issue objectively, if at all. It's generally just crickets in the mist. There's simply nothing. And the bought and paid for media, such as the National Post this morning, etc., is going to cover this as though the JNF is simply being abused by veins of anti-Semitism that are running rampant within the CRA. Don't trust that line, and I would say wait for the outcome. Thanks very much, and I'll be pleased to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Miles, and thanks to all of the other panelists. We will move forward now to questions from the media, and we have a couple. I'm going to turn to Nora from the Electronic Intifada and just allow you to unmute. I would ask everyone else to also turn their cameras on as well. Nora, you can go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much for this. This is really important, and it's I always relish the opportunity to report a little bit of good news amidst so much bad news these days. One question that I have is about the pressure, and Miles, you alluded to this, that the JNF and other Zionist organizations will undoubtedly use to try and get, the CRA to, I don't know, reverse its decision if that's something that that could happen, or at least give the JNF another pass. How can Canadian civil society help resist that pressure and make sure that the charitable status remains revoked and that the JNF Canada can be held responsible?
Okay, so I will open it up maybe with Sam if you want to start, and maybe Shane and others follow.
Sure. Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Nora, for the question. I mean, yes, it's good to see some positive developments every once in a while, but I think it's always important to recognize that each positive development in the struggle will inevitably face resistance and pushback from well-established and well-funded entities aligned with Israeli interests. And this resistance is a reminder of the entrenched nature of the issues at hand and the powerful interests involved. To ensure that the JNF Canada is held accountable and that the CRA's decision is upheld, Canadian civil society is going to play an instrumental role and remain vigilant and proactive. And so just some suggestions on how this proactive engagement can develop: sustained advocacy and awareness, mobilizing public opinion, building alliances to push back, legal and policy advocacy, and continue to monitor and report on the process. It's all very important, but most importantly, that the pressure continues, because there is always going to be a counter force pushing back. And we need to recognize that this is an ongoing struggle, and every one of these developments is going to be met with pushback. And even though celebrating success is important, it's equally crucial to keep pushing forward and amplify actions and engage in continuous advocacy and never relent until the Palestinian right to self-determination is fully realized.
Shane, did you also want to pick up, and then others can jump in if they also wish to?
Sure. Yeah. Just to build on what Wesam said, I think another way, is for organizations who are involved in Palestine solidarity work to collaboratively seek intervener status in legal proceedings that are going to come up. So groups who are interested in a proceeding that's before the court, and in this instance, it would go before the federal court, they can apply for intervener status. All they have to do is show that they have an interest in the proceedings and that they'll make submissions that are both useful and different from the parties' submissions. In other words, submissions that would be different from those of the JNF and the CRA. Therefore, when the JNF inevitably tries to have the CRA's decision judicially reviewed, there needs to be a strategic and united effort among groups to intervene on distinct points to ensure that the court's aware of the widespread public interest in the matter and that it considers all of the relevant dimensions, including the context that we're in right now, which is this ongoing genocide in Gaza.
Others that would like to respond?
Well, I will only say that the widespread public interest, while legal is the case, practically, what attention are you actually getting? Has the Canadian press covered this issue at all, as far as you know? Has the Globe and Mail covered it? Has the Toronto Star reported on it? Has the CBC reported on it? I'm actually asking you, have they? Are they here at this particular program to receive some further background? So I think there's a lot of work to be done, not just in the legal field, but also in the public awareness field, where there's a concerted, it's almost like there's a concerted effort on the part of the media to ignore this issue and not to cover it.
Any other comments on that point?
I still think that you got to give kudos to those who have been championing this cause for years. I'm personally not surprised that mainstream media is not here. I have no expectation that they'll ever be here personally, and I think it's okay to just go ahead without them. And so I want to give a shout out to everybody who has been moving this forward since at least the 20-teens. Panelists within here, Rabbi Mivasair, thank you. And I think that's of vital importance. I think that there's a huge appetite at the grassroots to no longer be complicit in Canada with this genocide, to come to terms with our own genocidal history at the same time and move forward in that direction. And I think that, you know, I've learned a lot from Wesam personally in his assessments of linking up philanthropy and charity with colonialism itself. And that's something that's often overlooked. We're far more familiar and comfortable with getting behind causes that we can more readily identify, such as arms sales, etc., prison building. But philanthropy is often that overlooked third arm of that colonial system, right? You have prisons, you have warfare or policing, and you also have philanthropy. It's that soft touch. It's a harder sell to the Canadian public to get excited about, oh my goodness, a charity is getting revoked. It doesn't have the same take up, but we can make that work, and we need to begin to reframe that argument as well.
Great, thanks, Miles and others. Nora, do you have any other follow-up question to your initial question?
Putting me on the spot here. Yeah, I guess, you know, what I mean, this is an incredibly significant move that could have precedent for other Israel-aligned charities. I mean, I remember time is kind of abstract for me at the moment, but I think it was a few years ago when a charity was being held responsible for military recruitment for the Israel army. And, so what kind of precedent does this set for other Israel-linked charities, organizations that, that are not just profiting off the colonialism happening in Palestine, but specifically the last 10 months of genocide?
Shane, would you be okay to comment on Nora's question and comment?
Yeah, certainly. So this isn't without precedent, right? There has been instances in the past where status has been revoked, including matters that have actually gone through the courts up to the Federal Court of Appeal, involving donations being sent from organizations in Canada that have charitable status over to benefit the Israeli military, and those organizations losing their status. So it's not without precedent. The issue is that Canada knows what it has to do. It knows what the rules are. It has set those rules. The issue is that it's simply not enforcing them at the level that it should. The action taken against the JNF, or intended to be taken against the JNF, although it is a cause for I think people to be motivated to be pleased with the result of, this advocacy that's been going on for so long. It really is just scratching the surface. There's so much more that needs to be done. The flow of money from Canada to Israel, and specifically benefiting the Israeli military, is absolutely immense. Now, as Miles noted, to take action against a charity as large as the JNF is extremely significant. There has to be something there under the surface that we simply don't know about yet. Hopefully it'll come out in due time. But there had to be something very significant for the CRA to presumably to take action in these circumstances, and it remains to be seen. But I think what we are seeing here is a building momentum. Nora mentioned the other case about military recruitment. Although that organization wasn't a charity, it was an organization that was nevertheless violating the law openly in Canada, and people tried to take action against it in the courts. David being one of them, and that case remains before the courts. We're actually headed to the Court of Appeal in that matter in October, and the government tried to shut that down, even though it was a blatant violation of Canadian criminal law. So the state knows what the law is. The issue is that it's very selectively applying when and where it wants to do that. And we see this kind of state of legal exceptionalism as it applies to the Israeli military in Canada.
Thanks so much, Shane.
Could I possibly add one point? Sorry. What I would say, I would definitely echo that, but I would also say that the Canadian charitable sector, specifically as it relates to international recipients, is deeply, deeply flawed. And I think that more research is needed. The Canada to Israel subsector in that is full of illicit activity. I can attest to that through fact. But on the other hand, if we're talking about a sector that's worth just over $1 billion a year, I think it's highly notable that year after year after year, about $300 million per year has no direct national recipient to it. What that means is about a quarter of the money moving from the Canadian charitable sector out of Canada on an international level. When those charities are reporting what they are doing with their money, they feel free to not even list an international recipient. And so this sector is deeply, deeply unmanaged. It may be, certainly within the context of this conversation, it certainly is that the Canada to Israel subsector is deeply harmful. But the entire sector itself is the equivalent of the Wild West.
Thanks, Miles. I'm now going to and thanks, Nora, for your questions. I'm now going to turn to TRT and to Paul. I'm just going to ask you to unmute, Paul, and go with your first question.
Am I coming through? Is that
you are? You
okay?
are.
Wonderful.
Thank
Okay, thank you so much, Karen.
From Turkey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you, everyone, for this wonderful panel. I just have a couple questions. The first, if anyone knows why the CRA itself has not yet publicly announced the revocation, and what might Canadians do to help ensure laws which are supposed to prevent groups like the JNF from receiving charitable status, how can they ensure that those laws are enforced? So that's one. And other one is to Miles' point on the difficulty of getting people to see so-called philanthropy in a negative light. And there's a psychological dimension to it too. So perhaps Miles or Dr. Mate can answer it. Is what challenges still remain in shifting public understanding such that the JNF is seen, in keeping with Dr. Mate's three-part description moments ago, the criminal, colonial, and racist organization it is, rather than the charitable entity it's still has the reputation, I suppose, of being, and I guess one can say enjoy. So just those two questions.
Who would like to start?
Well, it's really hard to know what to say. It's an ongoing struggle. The media silence around this is not accidental. They cover all kinds of trivial and minor things. If a pro-Palestinian protester says even the most vaguely inappropriate thing, it's in the media, it's covered. This major decision by a Canadian government organization to stop the tax-deductible status of a racist, colonialist, and criminal organization is not even mentioned in the media. This is not accidental. And so as to how to turn that around, just ongoing work, whatever platform any of us have, the work of just peace advocates, we just have to keep going and realize that this is a long-term struggle. It's a long-term effort, and the game is stacked against us, as Leonard Cohen sang in his song. You know, everybody knows the game is rotten. You know, it's a rotten game, and it'll continue to be that way, and that's not going to stop us.
Thanks so much, Gabor, for that. You know, we have reached out to and worked with some fairly prominent media over the last couple of years who've been interested in the story, but it just never has gone ahead. Even as you say, you know, we've had some reach out, some media coverage internationally and with other media here, but the mainstream media, this seems to be, as you've spoken, a very difficult topic to get coverage on. Can I turn it to other members of the panel to respond to Paul's question?
I think that like this goes back to more like this sort of neoliberal agreement that the government will abandon looking after people and turn that over to the charity sector. And then what we'll do is simply incentivize for people to, you know, either get a tax break, or if you're the fortunate, ultra wealthy, make money out of that if you own a private foundation. And so that whole system is worth, you know, a couple, maybe $300 billion within Canada, employs about 10% of the population. And so we've made this sort of agreement, you know, I'm not sure how many decades ago, but this is the way we're going to move forward, right? Like charity is going to provide what should be all kinds of temporary or emergency stopgap measures, like food banks, for example, and make those permanent. And that's neoliberalism in a nutshell, and that's the role that charity plays, right? And so the notion that this sort of has to work, that we're not going back to you know, socialism or something to that level, is sort of baked into that equation. And so again, I'm just sort of like putting on my thinking cap, but there's a real sort of you treat charity as though it's some kind of holy part of some kind of, you know, honorable, and it should be, but it's not, you know, like, and so how do you get out from under that? How do you understand charity to be a potential source of harm or a home of harm? And then especially when you add Zionism and its rich history of propaganda and associating, you know, the Holocaust with the history of Israel, etc., and how like Jewish people are immune from criticism. It's a tough sell, but those two things combine when you're talking about the power of a Zionist charity to do harm and why people won't touch it.
Thank you so much, Miles and Dr. Mate. Yeah, just wondering, yeah, if anyone might be able to answer that first question about why it hasn't been announced by CRA, the revocation.
Yeah, either Shane or Miles, do you want to pick up on? I think we may have touched on that earlier, or David, that would be excellent. David, if you could do that.
Yeah, so Paul, you're asking why the CRA itself hasn't announced this, and
Right, yes.
So my
exactly.
understanding from dealing with the CRA, and actually I'll tell you, in 2017, when I was one of the 4 people who filed the complaint, We met with the director of enforcement in the charities directorate of the CRA in Ottawa, and he told us straight out, they won't say anything more about this. They have this idea of kind of confidentiality about specific cases. So the CRA is, according to him, like prohibited from publicizing any specific cases. So I would imagine, I don't know this, it's a good question for lawyers, that until a decision is finally made, it won't be published. It's not in the Canada Gazette. It's not on the CRA website. And I think that is probably just because of their routine, not publicizing any of that stuff.
Anyone want to add to that? I
Okay.
think it's the case. I think that is indeed the case.
It has to do with the reputation of a charity, right? And so if I'm a charity and I'm being audited, I may not have done anything wrong, and I may still pass that audit, right? And so if I have 500 donors and suddenly it's public that I'm being audited, I might suddenly find myself with 200 or none, even though I may have done nothing wrong. And so it's that sort of protection of privacy notion. That's as far as I understand the law, but I think you're correct, David.
Would be interesting to see if the CRA publicized things about, for example, Islamic Relief Canada or Holy Land Trust before they made a final decision. I mean, just to see, is this being applied evenly? Is everybody being treated the same? Or are they actually protecting Zionist organizations more than others?
Thanks so much, Paul, for your question. I will make
Thank you.
thank you so much. And I'll just make one final call out in case there are a couple of other journalists that haven't asked questions I know that are on with us. In case there is anyone else, if you can please, I guess if you can either raise your, well, probably what we need you to do actually is put a little note in the chat if there is anyone else.
Are you on mute?
Somebody, I'm not sure who's speaking there, but I would allow somebody to unmute if they're journalists asking a question. Other folks, I have put my email address into the chat so we could follow up after. So we are just approaching the hour, and I want to thank those who have attended from the media and others who have joined, and very much thank the five panelists, Gabor, David, Wesam, Shane, and Miles for being with us. The posting is already live on Just Peace Advocates YouTube if you want to watch, and we will be sending out other information from Just Peace Advocates and other organizations. We want to thank very much IJV and David Mivasair and others who've been involved in this work for a decade or so, along with people who have been following and doing work related to the JNF here in Canada and elsewhere over many decades, actually. So thank you everyone for joining us, and have a good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. Thank you so much. Bye bye, everyone.